The curious case of Bryan Johnson, the man who wants to live forever. So, Bryan Johnson is an American tech entrepreneur, a man in his mid-40s who sometime in 2013 sold a company of his for a whopping $800 million, and since then embarked on a mission to defeat nature. In other words, to never die. The result? He's got a team of 30 medical personnel and spends an approximate of $2 million on a yearly basis in a bid to achieve his goal, which is quite simple: defeat death and live forever.
It's really simple. I basically don't trust anything in reality. Not authority, not my mind, not my perception, nothing. I just trust data and numbers. And the only thing I believe in is I don't want to die.
Do you believe that there's a possibility that you won't die?
Yes. Unquestionably.
So you get to hear his thoughts and ideas for the very first time, and your immediate reaction is to think, well, he must have lost the plot, right? No, not quite. You see, I shared a common sentiment as you when I first heard what he was up to. But then I went on to invest a little bit of time trying to get to the depths of what this man is thinking. That meant I had to read his book, Don't Die. You can find it online, as well as go on to listen to a good number of his interviews on quite a good number of podcasts. So I could actually get into his mind and actually understand what this man is up to. And when you actually get into the heart of what he's saying, you realize two things. One, that he's a very smart man. First and foremost, there isn't anyone worth about $500 million who isn't smart. And secondly, you realize he's on a very noble course. He's actually very well intended for humankind. This man right now is actually the world's most medically assessed man. That's to say, you've had a lot more medical examinations on this man than on any other human being in the world. In other words, this man has made of himself a human guinea pig, all for humanity's sake, in a bid to push the limits of our understanding of death and get to see us live a lot longer than we currently do. And that, of course, is noble. And right here and now, I believe it's important to make this clarification after having spent quite some time listening to this man. You see, sometimes he sounds as though he really wants to live forever. And that, I understand, is what a lot of people do not quite find intelligible. I understand. But the truth of the matter is, that's not what he's actually for. He understands that death is inevitable. And there's actually an interview of his, I think with Carlson, where he acknowledges that he could actually get to die by way of an accident, all right? Because death, as we know it, is not always the end result of age.
I mean, I think it's likely inevitable that I will die the most ironic death. I'll get hit by a bus, or I will choke taking a pill, or it's guaranteed to happen.
And so this guy understands that, well, death is inevitable in a sense, but he understands as well that by way of science and understanding the human body better, we could push the edge of death just a little bit further and get to live a lot longer. And that's where the mission he's on becomes a noble one. And you've got to understand that every time a people have challenged the intellectual status quo of an era, they have been met with ridicule and mockery until much later on they are celebrated. Imagine the Wright brothers, for example, going around and telling people they had a vision of people flying in the sky. And think of what people must have thought of them and their dreams. They must have thought of the Wright brothers of having lost the plot. But here we are today, flying on a day-to-day basis and having to celebrate them every time we do so. And so I believe this man, Bryan Johnson, to be on a noble path and ought to be celebrated even in our day. Now, with all that being said, I get to give my 2 cents on what I really think about the idea of having to live forever. And quite frankly, I do not think it is a laudable idea. And I do not think people would actually wish to live forever if they understood all that it entails, all that it takes, if they understood the full package. It is an obvious point, of course, all right, that having to live forever would mean us eventually getting overpopulated and probably running out of resources. Now, you got to understand that even if our technologies and intelligence stop us from running out of resources, we would eventually run out of space. whether we like it or not. By way of our population, we will run out of space. And right now, I just thought of an Alan Watts quote where he said, death actually is honorable in that every time a person passes on, the person makes way for some other person to be able to live comfortably. So of course, that's an obvious reason for which no person should crave wanting to live forever. But I'd like to emphasize more on something much different. You see, I'd like to focus more on the idea of suffering. In that life as we know it is suffering, all right? The opening words of the Buddha, life is suffering. And that, of course, is a truism we cannot argue with. Life is suffering. You see, one of the ways I make people get to understand what the whole notion of life being suffering is all about is by comparing life to a pendulum. You see, life is like a pendulum in a sense, where we have to continuously swing from one direction to the other, all right, in a bid to mitigate the suffering. But the equilibrium position, the resting point of the massless rod, is suffering. Now, let me give you all an example. Imagine a child being born. From the very moment the child is born, first we have a cry, which is a sign of discomfort, but that's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is from the very moment the child is born, the child starts to swing left and right. The baby is swung left for food and swung right for clothing and swung left for comfort. The baby is swung to every direction just to keep the child alive, all right? But if you let the child at the equilibrium position, which is to say, without any attention, without any food, no clothing, no nothing, the child suffers and dies. And of course, it's the same thing through our life. As adults, you gotta keep swinging. You gotta keep swinging. You swing to school and swing to the bank and swing to work and swing to the party and swing to family and swing to all these directions, all right? For money, for knowledge, for comfort and all that, right? We keep swinging. Every blessed day, we gotta swing. But the equilibrium position is suffering, which is to say, if you didn't swing to any of those directions I just mentioned, if you stayed put in one position in a home, you would run out of resources and you would die. Emphasizing the point I'm making, that life is suffering. Now, with that in mind, that life is suffering, what do you think a combination of the suffering and having to live forever produces? Hell. Why? Because now you have to deal with all the vices of life. Sickness, heartbreak, lies, evil, just to name a few. Forever. In other words, you get to deal with eternal suffering. And that, my friends, is the very quintessential definition of hell. Now, how do you avoid such hell? It is by advocating first for a utopian society where it's all good. And there is no sin, and there is no evil, and there is no heartbreak, and there is no suffering of any kind. If you get such a humanity, and then you get to live forever, in that case, you get to experience heaven, which is bliss and happiness forever. Which of course we understand is an impossibility, right? It's nothing like the human condition, because the human condition is the former, not the latter. But let's assume that by some miracle, by some magic, we get the latter. We get a utopian society. Even at that, would anyone really want to live forever? The answer is no. Why? Because the sheer monotony of having to live forever in this utopian heavenly society forever becomes hell in itself. Because no pleasure will feel pleasurable after a million years of repetition. And no bliss will feel blissful after a billion years of repetition. And so what we really want to be craving for is pushing the boundaries of death or the boundaries of life to a comfortable margin, so we can live long enough to accomplish all that we desire, but not without the possibility of dying. Because when you think of it deeply, you realize that as awful as the concept of death or the reality of death might seem, it fits quite perfectly into the puzzle of universal intelligence. And what we want to do is challenge nature the best we can, but never hope nor wish to defeat nature, because we cannot do that. And so the best we can wish for is a long, fulfilling and happy life, but not to live forever. Yeah.